Hello, welcome to International Affairs on the negotiations regarding climate change happening in Paris. We have two speakers today. Desiree McGraw has more than 20 years of experience as a consultant, researcher, reporter, senior advisor, and spokesperson in the field of sustainable development. In 2007, Desiree was among a select group of Canadians to complete a training with former US Vice President and Nobel laureate Al Gore on the science and solutions of climate change. And she went on to co-found Mr. Gore's Climate Reality Project leadership program in Canada. Desiree first became involved in international organizations at age 18, when she was appointed by the Governor General of Canada to serve as a youth advisor to the Canadian delegation to the UN's third special session on disarmament. Since that time, she has served on a number of other Canadian delegations to UN conferences, including on Environment and Development, Rio 1992, the Biodiversity Convention, Nairobi 2000, the Climate Change Convention, and the Kyoto Protocol in Montreal 2005. Following her appointment by UN Under-Secretary General Maurice Strong to serve as one of the two youth ambassadors to the 1992 Earth Summit, she spent 4 years working as an international reporter for the UN Earth Negotiations Bulletin. She currently serves as president and head of Pearson College, one of 15 United World Colleges, prior to which she headed the Jean Sauvé Foundation in Montreal. In her prior capacity as senior policy advisor to the Prime Minister and Director of Policy to Canada's Minister of International Cooperation, 2003 to 2006, Desiree coordinated all key ministerial files in the areas of sustainable development, stakeholder relations, and multilateral organizations. Johannah Bernstein's entire professional life has been devoted to the cause of multilateral environmental diplomacy and advocacy. She is an Oxford-educated international environmental lawyer, combined with a BA in human ecology, and a veteran of the Rio process with over 20 years of professional experience advising UN organizations, national governments, and the private sector, and international non-government organizations on a wide spectrum of global sustainability challenges. Johannah has an exceptional command of the United Nations system, combined with her unique knowledge of global sustainability issues and the power dynamics of multilateral environmental diplomacy processes. Since 2009, Johannah has focused her work on international sustainability policy issues with several Geneva-based United Nations agencies and international organizations, such as the United Nations Environment Programme, assisting in design and facilitation of the World Mountain Forum, preparation of sustainable mountain development strategy.
Thank you. Actually, I've got two mics, so is this one working? Can you hear me? Thank you for that introduction. And it's really a privilege to be able to address international affairs and to do so with my very dear friend and colleague, Johannah Bernstein. Before diving into the presentation, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about integrating some of this with my own personal story, because for me, the global climate negotiations are deeply personal. And Johannah and I first met in the lead up to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. How many of you have heard of the Rio Earth Summit? The UN Conference on Environment and Development, which was actually preceded by the Stockholm Conference, the UN Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972. So you can see the globe has been working on these issues for a few decades. And you've all heard the story about my coming to Pearson when I was 16. I'm not going to go into that again, but I don't think I told you the rest of the story. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the rest of the story and how it relates to this story. Towards the end of the Cold War, so 1989, many of us who were involved in the peace movement and the nuclear disarmament movement, as that wound down or the threat became less great, many of us became involved in the environmental movement. So this was the late 80s and going into the early 90s. How many of you have heard of David Suzuki? So David Suzuki is one of Canada's and the world's leading environmental scientists. He's a he's a geneticist, in fact. He lives here in British Columbia. And following the tour, those of us who were on that SAGE tour that ended at Pearson went on to do a video series with David Suzuki called Alive in the Nuclear Age. And through my work with Dr. Suzuki, hard not to get involved in environmental issues. So from SAGE, a couple of us from the SAGE tour started SAVE, Student Action for a Viable Environment. But we decided at the age of 18 that we were too old to speak to our high school students. And we decided to recruit other Canadian students, also more representative of the country in its diversity, to take a year off school and go across the country on the SAVE tour. And so we coordinated that tour, and the SAVE tour actually became an ongoing national youth tour for several years. So again, now we're into the early 90s. As a result of that work, I was deeply honored to be asked by a great Canadian who passed away this weekend, someone who was a mentor to me by the name of Maurice Strong. He was the Canadian who chaired the UN Conference on the Human Environment. He was the person who chaired the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio. And he really is in many ways the grandfather, for lack of a better term, of the whole sustainable development movement. And I had the honor in 1992, leading up to the Earth Summit, of being appointed by him to be a global youth ambassador. So once again, I decided to take a year off school. So this was now in university, to take a year off school to speak not just to Canadian youth, but young people around the world about the importance of the summit and how young people can make a difference. And at the time, they were calling the 1990s the turnaround decade. This was the decade in which we were supposed to turn these environmental problems around, the decade in which we were supposed to solve these problems and set a better course for the future. And it was a time of tremendous hope and optimism. So I took another year off school and devoted really that whole year to raising awareness at the Earth Summit. So weaving into the story a little bit about the history of the climate change negotiations, at the time, the Earth Summit was the largest gathering in human history of governments, media, and non-governmental organizations. It was really a transformative event, and the Canadian government at the time was a leader in sustainable development. We were the first country to sign and ratify a number of conventions that came out of that summit. So some of the big outcomes or outputs from the summit were the UN Biodiversity Convention, a framework agreement or statement of principles, I should say, around forests, something called Agenda 21, which is an action plan for sustainability into the 21st century, and last but not least, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this was an agreement that emerged from the Rio Earth Summit, and Johannah will go into greater detail about the nature of these agreements, but it was a general agreement to help the planet stabilize greenhouse gas emissions so as to avoid climate change or minimize climate change. It was not a very precise agreement, so in the wake of the Rio Earth Summit, several years later, countries began negotiations toward a sub-agreement, or what's known in international law as a protocol. This protocol was then adopted in Kyoto in 1997, otherwise known as the Kyoto Protocol. So this is a sub-agreement to the UN framework on climate change. And ever since that UN framework, UNFCCC, started meeting after Rio, once that framework convention entered into force, that is, enough countries had signed and ratified it so it became legally binding. Every year since then, there has been a meeting of the Conference of Parties, otherwise known as the COP. So the meeting happening right now in Paris is the 21st meeting of the COP. So these meetings have been going on for some time, since the early 90s, and in fact, even before, if you look at ozone and a number of other agreements. So they've been going on for some time, and we can talk about whether they have anything to show for it. So Paris is the 21st Conference of Parties and to the UN Framework Convention. And so through all of this, after the Earth Summit, I went back to school, completed my university degree, and then spent 4 years working as a reporter for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which was actually started by Johannah Bernstein, our special guest today, and a number of other individuals. and it was originally called the Earth Summit Bulletin, and it was just an amazing, and to this day, the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, if you Google it online, you can see what's happening in all of these biodiversity, climate change, forest, multilateral negotiations. So that was a great training ground to really dig into these negotiations and understand, and eventually the Biodiversity Convention became the subject, the focus of my graduate work at the LSE, where I looked at sort of the north-south dynamics in these global environmental negotiations. So then, fast forward to Canada, I came back to Canada and continued to follow these negotiations, but not so much as a reporter anymore, but as a teacher, as a lecturer at McGill, where I lectured for 8 years in the International Development Department and helped with outreach starting at the new McGill School of Environment. And it was great because I was teaching something I was deeply passionate about, and had the honor and fun of teaching with Johannah. So I was teaching in international development, but Johannah and I did a simulation with our students over the course of a whole week, a term sometimes, around these global sustainability issues. And then we had a course on climate diplomacy, which was lots of fun. And so some of you who are participating in the simulation these days, you're getting a very, very condensed version of what that climate diplomacy workshop was. And of course, Johannah teaches these things at many universities around the world, but we had the good fortune and a lot of fun to do that together at McGill. After that, I then, as was mentioned in the intro, went on to work for a previous Liberal government under Paul Martin, and was a senior advisor on international cooperation, which included sustainable development. And I guess I will say this, as I became, in a way, sort of working my way to advising the minister and advising the prime minister, the reality is I felt I had less and less time to understand the issues, and yet have to turn around very quickly, like memos of advice and provide advice on where I thought the country should be going. When I was at McGill and when I was at the LSE and when I was a student and then a teacher, I felt a lot more time to really think through my positions, but perhaps didn't have the same opportunity. I have to speak, sorry. The same opportunity to have influence, but a lot of, so I always say there was sort of an inverse relationship almost between the time that I had to think and reflect on issues, and then the opportunity to have real influence on some of the decision makers. In 2005, at the very end of the Martin government, Canada had finally, after a decade of rhetoric, but very little action by Canada, lulling Canadians into a false sense that we were actually doing something about climate change. Meanwhile, our emissions were going up. At the very end, we finally had a plan after Kyoto entered into force. This is now 2005. So it took Kyoto 8 years to become legally binding on countries because it required 1/3 of countries representing 1/3 of global emissions to sign on and ratify. And so it took 8 years for enough countries to do that. So you can imagine in the meantime, these negotiations are ongoing, emissions are going up. In my view, and I don't want to sound too cynical because I am a hopeful person, but it really felt like an exercise in planetary procrastination. Ongoing negotiations with really very little to show for it. I hope that's changing now. So at the end of 2005, Canada finally had a plan. I was on the Canadian delegation, which is in Montreal, and that was a good thing because I was 9 months pregnant with my first son, Jack. I didn't know it was going to be a son or Jack at the time, but 9 months pregnant, and my doctor and my hospital were in Montreal, and I had been commuting from Ottawa for my job. So the summit was in Montreal. It was chaired by the current Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada, Stéphane Dion. He was the Environment Minister at the time. And at the time, Canada once again was leading on climate change, and not just with words, but with real action and a real plan. So I felt very optimistic. So I went into the hospital from that summit feeling very optimistic, went into labor, went into the hospital feeling like, wow, my kid's gonna have a good future here. This is good. The world's coming together and we're gonna solve the climate crisis. Well, a few weeks after that, the Liberal government lost the election. And not to be overly partisan, but I think it's safe to say that under the government that's just completed its mandate over 10 years, Canada was in a very dark and debilitating place in terms of climate action. we had deniers, we had obfuscation, we had obstruction of international climate negotiations, and we even had, Canada was the only country to actually withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol, had no real intentions of meeting its targets. So we wasted really another decade, certainly in Canada. And Canada, along with Australia and Japan, a number of countries, we were called the axis of environmental evil, and it was the US, Japan, and sorry, it was the US, Canada, and Australia, and we were constantly, every year, we got the Fossil of the Year award at these convention meetings, so it was not a good time for Canada. And I remember feeling a deep sense of despair, but I thought, wow, I can't, because I'm a parent and I'm responsible, and I've just spent the last 2 years reporting and drafting policies and lecturing, but I felt a deep sense of urgency. And so I decided, I was up late one night, as you often are with babies, and I was watching David Letterman, and he had Al Gore on, and I had admired Al Gore because I knew him from, not personally, but knew of him, I should say, from the nuclear disarmament movement in 1988 when he was running for president. He was deeply involved, and then of course he was at the Rio Earth Summit. And around the Rio Earth Summit, he came up with a book called Earth in the Balance. And he talked about in that book how he, leaving a baseball game, he lost hold of his 6-year-old son's hand, and his son was hit by a car and went flying and ended up in the hospital and basically was on life support, and he thought he was going to lose his son. And it's while his son was in the hospital that he wrote Earth in the Balance, a deeply personal book which really tapped into his values about sustainability issues. And I remember being very, and I had read, of course, Earth in the Balance, and I remember feeling, wow, you know, and he talked about how when he almost lost his son, these issues that he'd been working on as a senator and in all these different capacities became deeply personal. They felt very raw and very real. And that's how I felt with the birth of my son. I felt like I'd been working on these issues since I was fairly young, but somehow they became kind of almost like intellectual exercises. Oh, I'm gonna write this really neat brief, or I'm gonna try to come up with this clever plan. And I had sort of lost, in a sense, that raw, real connection I had to the issues that I cared about, the way that I cared about them when I was 16 years old, in fact. And it took the birth of my son and the loss of a new government coming in that was denying that these problems were happening to reactivate me, to reactivate my activism, if you will. So I was watching Al Gore on David Letterman, and he said, I'm going to, so David Letterman asked me, so what are you going to do for an encore? You know, you've just come out with this Oscar-nominated documentary, Inconvenient Truth. What are you going to do for an encore? And he said, I'm going to train 1,000 people to give a local personalized version of the Inconvenient Truth. And I thought, that's it. I want to be one of those people. Long story short, I made my way to Nashville a few months later, and I was at the last training where he achieved his 1,000 target. And I basically spent my entire maternity leave, one, writing a long 70-page document for government, well, what I would hope would be government policy, but didn't become government policy, but also doing these presentations. I did something like 50 presentations in the first couple of months. So I spent my mat leave doing that, and was just had a deep sense of urgency. And what was so wonderful about it was I felt like I was reconnecting with my 16-year-old self. I was out there on the front lines, talking to people about issues that I cared about and trying to make a difference in the day-to-day. And so I couldn't keep up with the demand. None of us who did the presentations, who did the training with Mr. Gore, could keep up with the demand. So we thought, okay, we've got to bring Mr. Gore to Canada, and we've got to train a whole bunch more Canadians so that they can go and give presentations. So we brought Mr. Gore to Canada. A few months later, he came to Montreal. He trained another 250 Canadians, because we were only 20 at the time. 1,000 were mainly American. And we created the Climate Reality Project and launched that across the country. And now the Climate Reality Project has reached 1 in 10 Canadians through its presentations. I think Tessa gave one here recently. There you are, Tessa. So Tessa did the training. And worldwide, the Climate Reality Project, which is now a global movement, have reached over 5 million people on the science, solutions, and impacts of climate change. So with that being said, and very little time left, I'm not going to give you the whole Al Gore presentation. I'm sure Tessa did a brilliant job with that. but I will just use the rest of my time to touch on a couple of things about the science, and then I will hand things over to Johannah. So if we could just go to the next slide. So oh, here's the clicker. There we go. There we go. Okay, so in the last few months, there have been two really important climate thresholds that have been crossed. One, we've passed, we've crossed the 400 parts per million. That's concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which has a direct correlation with temperature. CO2 and temperature are directly correlated. And so we are now, we've crossed the 400 parts per million. Most of human history has been, or recorded history has been 275 parts per million. And I'll tell you in a second about why the 400 parts per million is important. Well, essentially, I'll tell you now. So 300, there's some debate between 350 and 400, but certainly 400 is beyond what is considered the safe operating space for humanity. This is according to climate scientists going back to 2009 in Nature magazine. And that number has dramatically changed the terms of the climate debate. In part because we recognize it discredits the idea that climate change is something that will happen in the future. It's something that's happening now, and the impacts are becoming extreme for many parts of the world. So that's one very important tipping point, and this was recorded in August of this year by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where carbon concentrations exceeded 400 parts per million for the first time for over a month. Second tipping point, global average temperatures have risen by 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This is critical for the simple reason that it's the halfway mark to the 2 degrees Celsius increase, which science tells us is the gateway to runaway climate change. So we have passed those tipping points, and we hope that that science and not politics informs the negotiations that are currently happening in Paris. And so what you have here, sorry, just go back here, yeah. So what you have here is the relationship on the left here, that this graph is showing the increase in CO2 concentration, so that's parts per million, and the relationship with temperature. So you see temperature rising, and to 2015 will likely be, as years preceding, the hottest year in recorded history. So these are some serious, considerations. Just going through this, there are other indicators of a warming world. So the distinction, you often hear global warming and climate change used interchangeably, but they're not. The increase in CO2 and other greenhouse gases create a greenhouse effect that increase temperatures. That warming, that global warming, causes changes in the climate. So global warming is causing the climate to change. And how that's demonstrated, so increased temperatures, but you also have increased humidity, you have increased sea level, the heat content of the ocean is increasing, sea ice is melting, snow-covered glaciers. You probably covered most of this in Tessa's presentation, so I'm going to skip over a lot of it, but basically you have a number of impacts from global warming due to resulting in changes in the climate. And so these things are happening rapidly. So I'm just looking at time and kind of rushing through this. We will also leave these slides with those of you, we will circulate these slides to all of you here in the audience. By audience, I also mean the virtual audience who are maybe watching online. What you have now also is the sea ice is melting and breaking off, the land ice as well, and it's that land ice in particular melting that is causing the greatest contributor to sea level rise. So the heat in the oceans causes some expansion, but it's predominantly the breaking off of that sea ice that is contributing to sea level rises, and that's problematic for many countries of the world, but particularly small island developing states. And Johannah will talk about those in the negotiations, in her presentation. And we have some students here who are representing those countries in the negotiations. So as I talked about shrinking sea ice, declining, particularly Arctic and Greenland, you have a retreat of our glaciers. Our glaciers are the largest, hold the largest amount of fresh water, so that is hugely problematic. These are major, major changes occurring as a result of global warming. What you're seeing as a result of many of these things is a perfect storm, if you will, that are increasing the severity and frequency of extreme weather events. And so we are seeing that across the globe, natural catastrophes on a major increase over the last 30 years. And then I think I'll just, and again, looking at time, want to give Johannah enough time and want to give all of us a chance to have a real discussion about this. Of course, climate change has impacts on other major global issues. So just to identify a few of them, climate and poverty. The World Bank estimates that the number of people living in extreme poverty this year is last year I should say, 702 million, or 9.6% of the world's population. But the World Bank also estimates that as many as 100 million more people will slide into extreme poverty because of rising temperatures. The adverse effects of climate change will disproportionately affect poorer countries with economies predominantly based on natural resources. Climate-related shocks and stresses, which are already a major obstacle to alleviating poverty, will worsen with climate change. On gender, well, partly because more women live in poverty than men, women will also be disproportionately affected around the globe by climate change. 70% of the world's poor, in fact, are women. So even though women are disproportionately affected by climate change, it's really important that women and men play an important role in decision-making at the local, national, and global levels around climate change, because they're major stakeholders. Climate change and justice. There's a principle that Johannah may elaborate on in the negotiations called common but differentiated responsibility. That is that we all have a responsibility, but it's different, because the reality is, on a per capita basis, most of the emissions come from the industrialized world. In fact, less than 1/5% of the world's population in OECD countries, or industrialized or developing countries, have contributed to more than 3/4 of historic greenhouse gas emissions. So we, the developed world, bear a disproportionate amount of responsibility in terms of having created the problem. And so we also should have a greater responsibility in terms of solving the problem. And this is recognized, for example, in the Kyoto Protocol. So at the same time, it's developing countries in particular that will be most greatly impacted. All of us will be impacted and are being impacted by climate change, but developing countries in particular will be the most adversely impacted. So there's an issue of justice at play here called climate justice. And in terms of security, there are already a number of hotspots around the world that have been exacerbated or indeed created by changes in the climate. So impact on freshwater, conflict over freshwater, declines in food production, climate-induced increases in storm and flood disasters. Climate-induced conflicts will result in a growing wealth divide that is resulting from this disproportionate vulnerability and adaptation burden faced by developing countries. And one final link is migration. Of course, we've talked a lot about the Syrian refugee crisis, and as we should. And so to add to that, when we look at the impact on migration and climate refugees, if you will, or refugees as a result of climate change, we're looking at some staggering numbers, and you know, we're already, the world is already grappling with refugees due to political or other conflict situations, and with climate change, we're looking at an exponential increase in refugees that will be fleeing countries and places that are just you can't inhospitable to human life. So for example, I believe it's the Maldives, Johannah. It's the Maldives, which is one of those low-lying developing states. They had a cabinet meeting a few years ago underwater to demonstrate, that, we talk about the impact on our country and that this is a justice issue. Well, for some countries, it means like the country will disappear as a result of climate change. So this will cause major displacement of people. So I'm going to leave it there and just perhaps conclude with where, and as I hand this over to Johannah, now that we're in 2015, I do believe that there is these facts that I've just kind of a whirlwind of slides. These facts, if you take them seriously, and I hope you do, because they're based on science, they're based on evidence, are depressing. They're depressing. So, even though there's reason to be intellectually pessimistic based on the facts, I believe that we have to be operationally optimistic. We have to be optimistic in our actions. I do believe there is time to turn this around. Not a huge amount of time is the reality, the science will tell us, but we do have an opportunity to turn this around. I don't believe in passing the buck to the next generation. I think I often hear, and you probably often hear, well, the next generation, they'll figure it out. They'll get it sorted out. Youth today, they're really enlightened. You are. And Pearson students and UWC students in particular. But I believe in working in partnership with young people to solve these problems. And I think we need to be doing that in many different ways, at the local level, individually. But I think we also need to be thinking about influencing macro policy, because no matter what we do individually, even in our own communities, is necessary, but it is not sufficient to solving the global climate crisis. We need to be engaged at all levels in creative ways and use all of our talents and energies to rally really to combat this issue. And so I know that we can do it, and I look forward in the discussion to talking about ways how we can help solve the climate crisis. And it's up to each of us to hold our governments to account in Paris and beyond to make sure they make courageous pledges, and that the pledges they make, they actually implement and not just talk about them. So to talk more about the actual negotiations, the history, and what's happening right now in Paris, I'd invite my friend and colleague, Johannah Bernstein. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I first of all, while I get my notes, I first of all want to thank you, and I'll step away from the mic for a second because I can speak very loud. I want to thank you for an incredible welcome. You guys have opened your hearts and your home to me. I've had such a Pearson experience. I've been kayaking, I've been sailing, I've seen several harbor seals of seal otter. I've played shallow duos with Katrina. I've had amazing talks. Noah showed me the art studio. And we've already started our first negotiation simulation today at lunch, and last night we had a wonderful session. And I'm just so inspired and I'm humbled to see such extraordinary human beings. And I want to bring all of them back to Switzerland with me and Nashville as well. So on that note, let me dive right in. Now, I guess I need to do this one. Okay. All right, so I'm going to very briefly talk with you about the global climate regime so that we can move quickly to what's happening on Paris. So if you look at this very complex diagram, basically in the core lies the COP negotiation process. And you'll see all around, for example, on Looker's right, you'll see integration and the fact that climate policy is integrated by the Security Council, by the World Bank, by all the other UN agencies. On this side, implementation, you've got the regional groupings, the G20, you've got the multilateral development banks, and you've got the R20, which is the new alliance of subnational bodies. And then up on the top, you've got the non-state actors, civil society, business, the faith groups, the parliamentarians. And then down below, you've got, in a sense, the information disseminators, UNEP being a particularly important one. So I want to give you a quick an overview of the timeline, but before I do, to just pick up on what Desiree was saying about the relationship between the mothership, the UN Climate Change Convention, and the Kyoto Protocol. Remember that in 1992, the convention was adopted. It was ratified a few years later, but what's unique about the Framework Convention, it's not a legally binding convention, it's a framework convention that sets out foundational principles about what governments need to do about climate change. And Article 2 is very, very important. It basically commits member states to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, hands up if you think Article 2 has been respected. Yeah, that's what I thought. I agree. And so after 92, as Desiree said, it was basically felt, indeed governments felt, mostly the small island states, that we needed something stronger, we needed something legally binding that set out legally binding reduction targets. So the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in 1997, and then, as you can see, ratified, or rather adopted and entered into force in 2005. A number of reasons why it took that long, because ratification begins at home. Now, amongst my crack team of climate negotiators, where's the United States? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. All right. How did it work out for you in the Senate? Not so good. Not so good. You tried, but not so good. The United States didn't ratify, and had Russia not ratified, we would not have reached a threshold number of member states needed to actually enter into force, to have the Kyoto Protocol enter into force. So in 2004, where's Russia? Where are you? Yeah, great. Russia, why did you ratify? Yeah, where are you? Where are you? Why did you ratify? And why were you able to ratify? Thank you very much. Okay, very good. All right, so Russia ratifies, Kyoto enters into force, and then we continue to have, as Desiree said, the COPs every year. And basically in 2007, the COP that was held in Bali agreed to launch negotiations for a successor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol. But here's the important piece of information. The idea was simply to, as you know, the Kyoto Protocol had a commitment period that extended until 2012. And once 2012 came about, it would expire and we'd have a legal vacuum. So the idea was, well, we'll just go about and either negotiate an annex to the Kyoto Protocol. But in 2007, no one ever imagined that we would actually have regime change, and regime change in the most interesting way. So we basically, over the years, from each COP to the next, governments became less and less enthusiastic about a legally binding reduction, a convention with a legally binding reduction target. So in 2009, I'll go into detail later, led by the US, thank you, but please don't do this again. The US basically led the charge for voluntary pledge-based agreements that would basically fundamentally signal the end to Kyoto, which basically is what exactly has happened. And then I won't go into detail about subsequent COPs, but each COP helped to crystallize different elements of what the Paris Accord would look like. So, hold on a second. So as you know, the Kyoto Protocol, in fact, where did I have on my, oh yeah. So before I go into very brief detail about the weaknesses of Kyoto and what are the lessons we can learn from Paris, a bit about the challenges for climate diplomacy right now. And number one is that climate action is a race against time, as Desiree explained. Why am I not using my glasses? So the bottom line is that rapid, broad, and deep international cooperation is necessary. Raise your hands if you think that, from what you've read about Paris, that we're seeing rapid, broad, and deep international cooperation. Raise your hands if you think that's actually happening. Okay, all right. But the interesting thing about climate change is that it actually shares some really interesting features with other big, vexing foreign policy issues such as nuclear proliferation and terrorism. And if badly managed, they all pose a credible threat to the very foundations of security and prosperity. But they all have high degrees of uncertainty over the sensitivity, the range, the scale, and the speed over which the threats appear. But the three core elements will make climate change even more challenging. And one is the rapid pace. So the existence of tipping points, as Desiree explained, and I won't go into it, if we don't stay within the 2-degree threshold, we're going to be locked into a pathway that can take us to a time and place where 4 degrees becomes the norm. And if we get to that place, 4 degrees, if you look back 40 million years ago, when the planet was 4 degrees warmer, there was no ice and there were no humans. So the next key issue about climate change is that there's a very asymmetrical nature to the problem. And it's basically the fact that the largest 3 emitters, China, the EU, and the US, together now account for over 50% of emissions. But the reality, as Desiree pointed out, those countries who have caused the least damage are the ones who are going to suffer most. So that asymmetry, if you want to flip it over, the need for justice and equity has got to be deeply embedded in the Paris Accord, and we'll see in a second if that's the case. The other issue about climate change is that it requires deep domestic change. So, whatever happens in Paris, it's going to have to be ratified, and that will also see a number of years. But what has to happen most at the national level is we need to see a fundamental change in the way our energy markets work. We need to have governments do the disrupting of the energy markets. We need to see a transition to a low carbon economy, but we need to see governments muster the political courage to remove the subsidies that are keeping oil and gas at an artificially low price. And so overcoming these challenges is just going to require a new form of political courage that we haven't seen in a very long time. So basically, now about the strengths of the Kyoto Protocol. Very briefly, I would say the one important takeaway is that the Kyoto Protocol was actually embedded in the common but differentiated responsibilities principle. So what did that mean? Only developed countries took on legally binding targets. None of the emerging economies did. Where are my BRIC states? Raise your hand. Okay, China, where are you? China, you're there. China, why were you not expected to take on reduction targets in 1997?
Because given that our economy is not as independent as we are right now.
Exactly, and you certainly were very, very far from being a net emitter. So you can see in relatively short periods of time, the geopolitics has changed radically. Another strength of the Kyoto Protocol could be said the flexibility mechanisms, the joint implementation, the clean development mechanism, and emissions trading. But there have been a lot of problems with that. So what was once regarded as a strength in the system is now regarded as a weakness, which brings us to the weaknesses of the Kyoto Protocol. And let's look at those very quickly. So basically, since the Kyoto Protocol was, I was about to say emitted, adopted, or entered into force, emissions rose over 58%. And that's pretty significant considering that the aim of the Kyoto Protocol was to actually reduce emissions by a very paltry sum, may I say, 5 to 12%. But the chief problem is that, okay, now I want my climate negotiators to say this with me all together. What trumps what? Politics trumps science. At the time, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's most authoritative alliance of climate change scientists, argued at Kyoto that 60% reductions at 1990 levels was what was needed to avoid and at that time we weren't even talking about the 2-degree threshold, but to avoid dangerous climate change. And what did governments agree? 8 to 12%. And even with 8 to 12%, and this is when I start to channel Bernie Sanders, we couldn't even meet that goal. Thank you. It's not my best impersonation, but I'm working on it. Now, climate negotiators, why did we not meet the goal? Because what were we missing? Altogether, a compliance regime. There was no enforcement. There was no enforcement whatsoever, even though if you read the Kyoto Protocol, there's a darn good compliance regime. In fact, it's regarded as one of the most innovative climate compliance regimes. But what's the problem? The governments don't enforce. Why don't the governments enforce the compliance regime? It just makes me so mad. I'm going to get a little upset now. All right, so the lessons from the Kyoto Protocol, you know, are very important, because I want to ask you, as I go through these, we're going to ask ourselves, to what extent, to the extent that we know now, thank you, how much more time? Just read it out, 10 more minutes, are we learning these lessons? So number one, climate change, or the climate system, is a global commons. So what does that need, negotiators? A cooperative approach. Secondly, since sovereign nations can't be compelled to act against their will, we need to create incentives. And we'll talk later about whether Paris is doing that. Thirdly, we need a process of decarbonization, because since carbon-intensive economies can't be replicated, they simply can't. We have got to, by 2050, take carbon out of the equation. And then some of the other criteria: equity, justice, fairness. We need technological change, but we need the technology to be transferred to those who need it most. We need a cost-effective regime. And we also know that if we don't act now, the costs of actually addressing climate change increase exponentially. And there was a wonderful commission a few years ago that actually crunched the numbers and said that if we act now, the cost to the global economy will be considerably less if we don't act. And I won't, my negotiators know I make up a lot of figures as I go along, but you guys, you keep me on the track, on the path. So this is kind of what is going on in Paris right now. If it looks like chaos, yes, it really, really, really is. All right, let's talk first about the political context. Now, normally in a UN conference room, you've got rows and rows of governments with their nameplates that you probably won't be able to see. But here we've got the distinguished delegate from platitudes. Same old, verbiage. Romance, I don't know what that means. So I'm going to talk a bit about the political context very briefly. And as you know, what's on the table right now in Paris is a hybrid beast. You've got all the voluntary pledges, and you've got a package of measures of finance, of technology, adaptation, loss and damage, which are designed to bolster the pledges, because as Desiree mentioned, when the pledges are added up, what do they not do? Climate negotiators? Thank you. I can't see you, but it sounds like no. Very good. All right. So in terms of the political context, and this is very, very important. As one of Elisa, my sister's profs at McGill, Jean Crépeau, who drafted the Quebec Civil Code, would always say, listen very carefully, because this is going to make an excellent exam question. So here are some of the big picture changes in the climate context. One is that the negotiators have constructed a very different dynamic this time. Again, I call it regime change. So rather than setting overall limits and requiring reductions of every country, each individual country has set their own targets. The opening bid started by US, China, and Brazil. It's been an encouraging start. And actually now over 180 governments have indeed submitted their pledges. So for the first time in history, we actually know what governments are actually going to pledge. Good, bad, ugly is all of that. Another dynamic is that the US and China both engaged well in advance. As you know, there was a very historic bilateral agreement several months ago, and that was very important because why United States? Without China on board, what would happen? A bit louder.
We wouldn't be on board.
You certainly wouldn't be on board. So that really set a very important stage. Another important dimension is that we've got a technological and energy revolution underway. We won't talk about it, but the slides go into detail. For the first time, solar is at parity with oil, and that's changing the landscape. You know, 6 years ago, the renewables were not at a state of development where they could really penetrate the market the way they are now. That's a big, big, big factor. So for the first time, governments are actually negotiating an agreement with two revolutions going on. One, a technological revolution, and a political revolution amongst certain countries that indeed we have to act now. Now, as I said, with most of the pledges ahead of COP21, we have no surprises. Most of them are underway. But although we, again, as I said, the 2-degree threshold won't be met, what's happening, though, is that there is a changed political context where the new analysis confirms that climate action is actually good for growth and recovery. We've talked about renewables are now a credible alternative, and now more voices are calling for action. The Pope's encyclical was just paradigm shifting. We also know that the climate impacts are becoming so material and so immediate, and every negotiator is coming to Paris with a personal climate change story. So about the core issues, let me go on to that, and then we'll end. I think, how much time do I have left, guys? 10 minutes? You both put 5, so that would normally mean 10, okay, 5. So I always say I'm a low I don't do math, but when 2 hands of 5 go up, at least I do make 10, but anyway, there we go. So the long-term goal, negotiators, what's the long-term goal that's on the table? Thank you. What do we want to see on the table? Decarbonization by 2050. Do we want to see it by 2100? AOSIS, where are you? No. Another core issue is ambition on the NDCs. How do we fill that ambition gap? Yeah, it's a terrible acronym. The nationally determined commitments to pledges. So what would be the way that we would actually fill the pledge gap? We would bring in other emitting actors. That would be one of the most important things. The next issue, I won't go through all of them. Another way to fill the ambition gap is to bring in non-state actors, but to create a process, a very rigorous review, so that every 5 years, I would argue, where are my AOs, my sinking states? Do you think 5 years is enough for a review process? I don't think so. I think a lot happens in a year. Let's say a biannual review and a ratcheting up. That's another way to scale up. Another way to fill the emissions gap is a finance package. Negotiators, tell me what you've contributed so far. Where is the EU? What's the total figure? I shouldn't do that because I have a mic. What's the total figure that's been committed so far? Thank you. AOSIS, what do you think should be negotiated? What should be committed? 1 trillion, thank you. The difference, I can't do the math that differently, is enormous. Canada actually has committed 2.65 billion just recently, and together with what former Prime Minister Harper has invested thus far, 1.2 billion, do the math, we've got 3.85 billion, and that's actually the largest contribution that's been announced thus far in Paris. So another way to close the emission gaps is rigorous rules on measurement and accounting, because all the pledges, it's literally like comparing apples and oranges. Some pledges use a base year. Remember, Desiree said that there are 3 elements in a pledge: a base year, a reduction target, and a target year, right? So an example would be United States, you're going to, no, I'm sorry, let me use something. The EU will reduce by 30% by the year 2030, but based on 1990 levels. That's a good target. The United States has actually, its target looks more like 25 to 30%, but based on 2013 baseline. United States, why did you choose that baseline? Thank you. All right, and so some of the other issues about finance, we've talked about adaptation, you know, in the first COP, and I've been to 15 COPs, hence all the gray hair, that's quite nicely disguised. At COP 1, adaptation was not on the agenda. It was immoral to talk about adaptation. We were going to mitigate the SHIT out of this, right? Excuse me, but I had to say that word. And so mitigation for many, many years, that is to say, the amount by which we were going to reduce emission targets, emissions, we now know that we're in a situation where we really actually are shifting the focus to adaptation. So small island states, what are some of the big adaptation needs that you're facing? Very loud and clear. Well, you guys are going to have to be moving pretty soon, right? And the crisis of climate refugees is going to dwarf the current political crisis situation by a factor of 10, right? That's one element of adaptation that we're going to really have to crack. Some of the other issues, accountability, yes, loss and damage, compliance, and transparency. So these are the big issues right now. So as you can see with the current level of pledges, what's the problem? We're going to reach 3.5%. If we were on truly a 2% pathway, we would get to 2%. With no action, 4.5%. Here's a little nice report card. EU, top, China, well done. US, not so bad considering. Mexico, South Korea, Japan, Australia, where are you?
Yeah.
Why? Why Australia? Why? It starts with C and it ends with L, and there's O and A in between. Thank you. Cool. Yeah, I know, I'm a very fast speller. Canada and Russia. Russia, where are you? Speak now. Why so bad? Why so low? Not a problem. Thank you. All right. So basically, guys, I'm going to leave you briefly with what would an ideal agreement look like. An ideal agreement would, first of all, limit warming to 2 degrees. It would deal with a global carbon budget in a way that it would ensure that no more than 1,000 gigatons gets released, so we have a chance of holding to 2 degrees. We would decarbonize by 2050, and then we would fundamentally transform our economies onto a decarbonization pathway. Equity, I think that's equity. Equity would be critical so that, again, for the sake of fairness, rich countries would take the lead and decarbonize before the mid-century. And then we would unleash a wave of climate innovation for technology to help us to reach that path. And finally, we would safeguard carbon sinks. Those are carbon sinks and vital ecosystems. And then finally, we would scale up the level of financing. That would be the ideal agreement. So let me ask you this, based upon what you've read so far about, I mean, you can't read the news today without about 100 articles. And by the way, Desiree and I will be having an article published in the Globe and Mail online, and we'll be circulating the longer article. Are we anywhere near this, people? Raise your hands if you are confident that Paris is going to embody these elements of an ideal agreement. Yeah, okay, so on behalf of my generation, I'm really sorry. Thank you anyway.
And we'd love to have a discussion. So I don't know if we have mics or anyone has international affairs students, so I think we'll take a list. Okay, cool. Is there the little clippy one? Yeah, no, I don't have any more. I see two Anyway, we can start just in the interest of time. Should we just see a show of hands just to get a sense of, I mean, you may reserve the right to ask questions later, but just get a sense of. We'll take one at a time. I don't like.
Do we need the mics for the live stream?
Yeah, do we need to be standing here for the live streaming?
As long as it's loud.
Okay, so we can be loud. We'll try to be loud.
How have we not been loud?
Okay, great. So I think there are some hands up here. Just raise your hand. How many hands are here? So maybe what we'll do is we'll take two questions at a two or so questions at a time, and then we'll share answers.
Okay, maybe I'll just start off to get us going. As two very accomplished people who have a lot else going on in your life, and I've had like great conversations with you about your other passions, how do you find that balance between dedicating your life to something that you're passionate about and you know needs to be changed, and also, for example, raising a family or playing with your dogs and elves? How do you balance that?
Well, I know what it's like to raise a family, and I can tell you raising golden retrievers is a lot easier. For me, I cannot start the workday until I've had time in nature with the dogs and the interns, of which many of you will be. And it's a non sequitur, it's non-negotiable. And the more I can fill myself with ease and with grace and with creativity, the more effective I can be as a change agent. That's my question.
I have a less. My answer isn't as good because I'm not. That's been a challenge for me for sure in my life, and especially now that I do have a family. Full circle on 2015, of course, my first son, who was born in 2005, is now celebrating his 10th birthday. Just want to be here this weekend. But all that to say that it makes these issues deeply personal because you have some real, milestones, if you will. That has been a challenge for me, trying to find the balance, the sense of urgency that I feel. I think one of the things that I have done reasonably well is I have made wonderful friendships through the work. People like Johannah, you can imagine which one it is to teach with Johannah. So, we actually have sisters who are friends.
And who look more like each other than each other.
It's just all very coincidental, but it has been me making wonderful friends in the process of doing meaningful work together. And that for me has been really enriching. And building those friendships, not just because you like someone's personality or because they're funny, which is really important, but because they actually share the same values, and that makes a big difference. I'm not good.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so you're going to let us know who's next?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now we're going to take a couple of questions at once. Yeah.
As an Australian, I am deeply disturbed by my country's dismissive, flippant attitude towards climate change, and also our honestly pathetic target values for COP21. And I was wondering, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for your presentation and for your presence on campus, because I don't think I've ever felt this passion and this drive to do something about an incredibly pressing and personal issue. I wanted to know, how do we as students, as innovative young people with fire and drive, go about changing the attitudes of people in government who really, I don't think, care anything about sustainability over financial stability or economics? How do we go about that, Anne?
Great question. Do you want to name a few so that they're ready?
Yeah.
They know they're next.
I'd like to echo Claudia's and thank you so much for bringing this back. I feel like ever since coming through sexual resistance from the environment. So thank you for this. And my question is, following COP21, will there be any legal repercussions and what kinds of incentives will there be for all parties to comply to the agreements made?
And then maybe another one?
Isaac.
Sure. Again, thank you so much. You mentioned that the NDC's pledge so far by the parties does not meet what is required. What are these parties considering when they make these pledges, and why hasn't it reached the limit?
Do you want to start with the last two questions, and I can give you a question?
The voluntary pledges were a process of very intensive negotiation domestically. And, I think governments will commit to that which they think they can commit to, right? And so recognizing that they have to be ambitious, but at the same time, realistic. And that certainly is the case for many of the governments who put forward voluntary pledges. So I think that's one thing. It's a question of what they realistically could do. If you're a country with a big, heavy emitting industry sector, it's going to be a lot more difficult to sell a more rigorous pledge. But do not fear. The pressure is on. We know who you guys are. And we know that NGOs and indeed enlightened governments are going to push for a very rigorous process of review to ensure that A, governments are being held accountable, B, that they're not engaging in creative accounting. So the process of measurement and verification is going to be extremely important. And the issue about what to do if governments don't meet their pledges, what I can tell you is the idea of a compliance regime is not on the agenda right now. And the negotiators, anybody who's a climate negotiator will explain to you why. But what will happen is if governments do not meet their targets, the idea is that there will be a system in place to provide technological assistance to help them to meet. The idea is let's move away from the compliance mentality that is very fearful for sovereign nation states, but to really work very collaboratively with them. Does that answer your question?
There was Jackie's question about COP21 follow-up.
What happens after COP21? Okay, let's do the math. COP22, COP23, COP24. And right now, the targets go up to, most of the targets cover, for example, 26% reduction by 2030. Most of them cover 2030. So that means that the commitment period that we're now about to start will end in 2030. So that means that in 2030, this whole, and if any of you are Yiddish, fakakta process begins all over again, right? So, but again, the review process is going to be very, very important. We've got to get it right because, as we all know, we don't have the time to, we don't have the luxury of getting it wrong. So after this COP, every COP will review very carefully the process that we put in place. You can be sure that the Paris Accord that will be adopted in 2 weeks is going to have a lot of square brackets around it. Square brackets, as many of you know, basically signifies text that has not yet been resolved. I'm sure that very little will be resolved, so do not fear, Jacqueline. There will be another COP around the corner.
That's depressing. I want to do you think that I guess just on that, I think there are examples in international relations where there's enough political will and courage, you can really make some major changes. You saw that on ozone. You saw that on the nuclear issue to some extent. And I still believe in the power of political courage and leadership. And I'm hoping that's going to win the day. The political side, in a good way, will win the day in Paris. I'm always certainly an operational optimist. And we have examples in trade and security where countries are quite happy to have very strong compliance and monitoring mechanisms. They just don't want to do it on the environmental or social agreements because I explained this to the negotiation group. In the hierarchy of international relations, there are priority or high-level issues and there are secondary and lower issues. And the trade and security are high-level, and you better believe there are serious repercussions if you break a treaty or if you don't comply. But on the social and environmental issues, there's a real double standard. And what we need to do is make the case that these environmental issues are security issues. They are economic issues. They are environmental issues. They're health issues, but they impact. They're the game changers. So we need to make that case. In terms of youth, wow, I guess a couple of things. Young people need to speak truth to power. Of course, that's always an important role that young people play. I think we need to see more young people on these government delegations. You see that in some countries that, I believe in people kind of working in different ways. You can work outside the system, you can protest, you can work with NGOs. I think that's a really important way to work. You can also work inside the system, which is more what I did. I went from activism to kind of working on the youth delegate, on the Canadian delegation. And I saw that you could have impact in different ways. And in fact, having actors in different sort of inside and outside can be mutually reinforcing. So speaking truth to power, figuring out where you want to work in the system, outside as an NGO, protesting, advocating, or inside. The other thing I'm going to say, without being partisan, is I do believe getting involved in politics can make a huge difference, depending, of course, on the country that you're from. But studies have shown, certainly in democracies, that young people who are engaged in political parties actually can have real influence. I understand for most young people that is a complete turnoff, but the reality then is then there's young people who are filling those positions who are perhaps not motivated by the same things, maybe more self-interest or getting ahead, and not necessarily motivated by social or environmental values. So I'd like to see more young people who care about the planet working not only in NGOs, but also working with some more mainstream organizations to influence that from the inside. So I think it depends on who you are, what your passion is, what your talents are, where you like to kind of hang out. And then when I feel that when you have that passion and those skills meet with what you care about, you know, that's when you can really have impact. So I think it's a very individual answer.
And you know, Desiree showed me the other day a video of the Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna, who is inviting people of all ages to send us your messages, send us your concerns, your goals, your wishes. And why doesn't Pearson do something other collectively to send to Catherine McKenna, some sort of collective video? I think that would be wonderful.
And to all the environment ministers.
And to all the environment ministers around the world, that would be incredible.
Something, you know, there's still time.
Yeah.
The summit doesn't end until December 11th. The negotiations are
Yeah.
happening now, and if we can't be in Paris, maybe there's something we can do virtually.
Yeah.
So I think about how many people do we have on the list? Just two. Okay. So, well, okay. So we're going to keep our answers shorter, and the main thing is that we want to hear from you. So why don't we take five questions, and then.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, why don't people care about this? In my previous community, before I was at Pearson, it seemed like I was the only one who shared this passion about environmentalism, and I felt so lonely. And then I came here, and I was so excited about finding people who were similarly passionate that I didn't even find as many people as I would have expected. And for a lot of people here, it's not even their priority. When I gave my presentation on climate change, some of my very good friends decided to go into town and shop instead of coming and listening to what I had to say. And so I don't know how to help people care or why they don't care. And after 2 years of spending, of being in relative isolation here, I'm really frustrated about this, and I really want to hit the ground running when I'm at the university, and I want to bring people along with me. So I want to know why they don't care and how to make them care.
Okay, great question. Next.
So first of all, thank you for your presentation. As a student from Japan, I'm really happy to be here to evaluate the climate potential and create more sustainable. So my question will be, from Japanese perspective, I think, or from umbrella country's perspective, which country has higher CO2 emission per capita? I think in current economic system, maximizing profit economically wouldn't be maximizing the potential for CO2 emission reduction. So I think, do you think ultimately we should change the theory of economics? Then if the profit maximization fit with maximizing our potential to reduce the CO2 emission, I think even trade commitment, trade kind of alliance would work better to reduce emissions CO2, I think. So if we do need to change the theory of economics, how can we convince the people who have power who are getting benefit in the current society?
Thank you. Keep it going.
Can I ask a question? So I have a question about the decarbonization thing and all that. So, when we always hear about decarbonization, we hear about making the move from fossil fuels to renewables, right? So when we leave those fossil fuels in the ground, coal, oil, and other fuels there, are we not just procrastinating for future generations? Maybe someone in the future will dig them up again and start polluting the environment again. So maybe instead of leaving them just there in the ground, would it be better for us to find a way to use those fuels in an eco-friendly way? And then if someone in the future came and started using them again, that wouldn't affect the environment again, because we found a way to use them in an eco-friendly way. And I believe the problem now isn't just climate change itself, but also that the energy sources we have now don't meet the demand of energy we need. So what guarantees that renewable sources will meet the demand and we will not need fossil fuels? So if we provide a way that we can use fossil fuels in an eco-friendly way, we could do both, meet the demand of energy, and then do the decarbonization thing as well.
Thank you. We'll take two more. And just so you know, I think it's actually more important that we just hear from you, and we'll do our best. We will not be able to answer all your questions here, but we can continue the discussion. We want to hear from you. So take two more for this round.
So following up on Johannah's comment, coming from a developed country, for us to see discovering resources as something for survival. So we don't look at climate for the future, we look at how people are living right now. If people are dying and we have discovered oil, there's no reason we shouldn't go and, because they are right now building a refinery. There's no we shouldn't exploit it because we are thinking about climate change, because if people are dying because of hunger and we think exploiting oil will help us cover that. How do you think we can go around that?
Okay, great. I think one more for this round.
I have a visceral memory of the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl disasters. And yet, I also am skeptical that we, as Johannah pointed out, would be able to meet all of our energy needs with what we would classify as renewable resources. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on implementing more forms of nuclear energy into the equation. I don't see an intercontinental ship being powered by something other than nuclear energy, and I'm wondering about intercontinental airlines, power stations, etc. So I'm just wondering how you feel about it as perhaps a stopgap, because the main theme in one of the themes you mentioned was expediency.
Yeah, I'll start with that. First of all, thank you for the question. Decarbonization, the UN says that it's possible and it has to happen by 2050. 100% decarbonization. We've got to take carbon out of the energy supply completely. We have a slide that we did have a chance to, I'm going to stand up so I can project my voice the way. We have the technology to meet energy demand. If the slide I had would show you that the bulk of energy resources will come from solar and wind, and conservation will play a very big part, and a very, very, very tiny amount comes from nuclear. So what's happening is that in the renewable energy space, we're seeing a real revolution. The price of solar has come down. Coal plants around the world are being decommissioned. China can tell you that they're in a steadfast path to remove coal. About the question about keeping fossil fuels under the ground, we have to keep them under the ground if we're going to meet the gigaton gap, right? If you can stay below 2000 means 75% of the known reserves have to stay under the ground. We have to phase it out and ban it the way we phased out other carcinogens or environmental pollutants, the way we phased out ozone depleting substances, the way I hope we will phase out and ultimately ban tobacco. So that's one question.
And I think we'll just answer one more. We'll move on because there's 10 more people. So
yes,
I think to try to tie your point, Tessa, to some extent, the other points, this is an inconvenient truth. Yeah. It's deeply inconvenient. It's a real pain. Like when people say, you know, you're the environmental lobby and you have an agenda, it's like, no, I didn't want to spend my maternity leave giving these presentations. I'd rather be hanging out with my family, right? So getting people to care is people care, but they're in denial because the truth is really inconvenient and disturbing. And usually people disconnect because they feel disempowered. So in my presentations, not today, but when I give a climate presentation, I have a 50-50 rule. 50% is solutions. If you don't talk about solutions and people only hear about the science and the impact, it's so overwhelming that most people just disconnect. So that I would suggest is really important, is to give people a sense of hope and concrete things that we can do. There is no silver bullet. I don't believe personally in solving one set of problems with nuclear that creates a whole other set of problems for security, for storage. I think we can use our brains and our ingenuity to find solutions. And we've got to be organized. We've got to create incentives. We've got to stop subsidizing fossil fuels, and we need to subsidize renewable energy. And that's where the ingenuity will go. So I believe we can solve this problem, and we need to talk about those solutions and create a sense of hope so people don't disconnect, because it's hard stuff. Okay, next round 5, please.
Mary, Calvin, and then Kim. Yeah, I was just wondering what you believe the role of free trade agreements such as. I was just wondering what you believe the role of free trade agreements such as NAFTA or the recent Trans-Pacific on is for inducing positive environmental policies.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to go through all the remaining. There are 10 more, so we'll just keep going through them.
I'm from New Zealand, and each year we have an influx of immigrants from the Pacific, especially from countries such as Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji. And the majority of those immigrants are in New Zealand due to climate change, natural disasters. And so I was wondering if you could comment more on the nations who emit less CO2 but will suffer more because of the climate change due to the largest CO2 emitting countries in the world.
I think this question was already out there, but it's echoing the idea of a social. Do you have a sense that we're near a social tipping point where politics something like to actually be a positive thing, that social movement would insist that politicians act in a certain way, and then how can we be part of creating that social?
My question's for that.
I just want to bring the domestic perspective to this situation because we've been talking about the international negotiation. But once the international negotiation is done, it comes down to carrying out in your own country. And as we see right now, even though China has made a great pledge in the COP21, if we actually carry out that domestically, there will be huge social and political conflicts. And how can we resolve that?
I just feel like, seeing sometimes how like institutions that are like, governing our lives are really inefficient, focused, corrupt, and all these kind of things. Like, do you feel sometimes desperate, and do you feel the need for like a change in system, not just like working with a system that's basically huge and inefficient now? You like what Desiree said, you basically spent 8 years without the Kyoto Protocol actually binding legally in countries, which is really alarming insight.
We're so inefficient like that. Right? I feel like we need the system change.
Thank you. Great questions and comments.
I was just wondering what you see the role of smaller agreements between groups of countries is, and whether or not large global conferences like COP21 are still the most effective way of dealing with issues.
Those two are connected, by the way. Those are questions. But one of John's questions. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Maybe in relation to Kim's question, you mentioned the regime change of the COP in Paris this year, being that the countries coming in already have proposals. And yet, we looked at the 8 ideals of the COP in Paris and realized we weren't really going to meet any of those, which would imply to me that we're needing some sort of radical in environmental change. And I'm wondering where you see most hope, whether it be a country, a development, or something as such, it's really going to be that radical switch that appears to be so necessary.
The last 2 are Libby and Clark.
Oh, thank you. Actually, I think that Kyoto and other people preempted my question, which is really about the political implications, and I think this is partnered by hopefully the viewing of Naomi Klein's film, This Changes Everything. It seems to me that behind what you're saying, but it's like the elephant in the room, is actually capitalism isn't going to do this. So it's not really even a question, it's my statement. Capitalism isn't going to do it, and in this country, and in many other countries, the reason that there has been not the appropriate initiatives is that governments have been hand in hand with the corporate world, particularly the oil.
Okay, so I guess what based on science is going to get it here. So peace is a political goal, it's not a scientific goal. You will not find our climate scientists intensive to convert the people that really are trying to get to the peace. But we agree with this being a realistic goal. Look at what's happening in the environment. 1 degree is average. The West Antarctic ice shelf decided to break up irreversibly. It's a 50 centimeter
rise in sea levels, guaranteed. It's just not how fast it will happen. So the Montreal Islands, the east, we're sorry. So 2 degrees, we need to act a lot faster. That is not the goal. We have to get lower than that. And we're also about governments. We are individuals. Governments take their direction from us. What are you willing to do to lower your carbon footprint? If you want a world where everybody is going to live a good lifestyle like we do, we need to get our carbon footprint down to 2 tons. That's an estimate of some scientists, might be a little bit extreme. Where are you right now? So, Mark is 620. I've got a brother around 514. So I get really annoyed. You can tell I'm passionate when I hear people talking about we need to do this, we need to do that. But yet your actions do not reflect it. And that's the activism we need. Yes, you can lobby your government, but also cumulatively respond if you stop burning their product. Basic economics, I think somehow we agree. And we're not seeing that. So I have made many sacrifices. That's why I can be passionate. Let's see you guys do that too.
We got to build on this for a minute, okay? Because what are we willing to do? We drive to the soccer field to play our sports. We take boats out onto the water to dive. What are we willing to do? We take you on field trips in our cars. What are you willing to sacrifice? What are you really willing to give up? Are you willing to live here, work here, learn here, and give up some of this crap? Because I'm sorry, I drive that soccer trip and I feel guilty every time I do it. I think we have to, as a community, I'm sorry, but we have to, as a community, we need to decide what is important and what are we willing to give up, and when are we going to get electric cars? And when are we going to use them less and less and less?
I'm proud to say that I'm 54. I've never owned a car in my life. I've run a paperless office for the last 15 years. The only things I eat come either from my own garden or from a 100-kilometer radius. And I think these are it's a starting point. I don't even use home heating. I love the cold, as Desiree knows, and my interns suffer terribly when it's -5 and I've got the windows wide open and the heat down to 0. You know, the point that, what is your colleague's name?
Libby.
Libby, the point that you make, you need to So what we need is we need tax reform. We need to shift the tax base from income to consumption. We need to price the shit out of carbon. We need to science the shit out of this problem. We need to remove the fossil fuel subsidies that are keeping the oil and gas industry in business. We need to rapidly scale up finance to unleash the wave of technological innovation. My people, the renewable energies have never been as viable as they are now. My Nobel-winning climate scientist colleagues tell me, if we were to stop burning carbon today, 2 things. 1, we would have 100 years of unleashing of consequences because of the CO2 that's nested in the environment. But if we were to stop burning fossil fuels today, Jim Hansen, head of the NASA Goddard Space Institute, would say, we have got the renewable energies necessary to meet demand. Demand is another thing. What the hell are we doing? Why are all these lights on? We've got to think, every individual, it comes back to you, Tessa. We can talk in the dark, it's okay. Is that we have to start with ourselves. What can we do as an individual? What can we do as a community, as a family, as a province, as a group of young people? And there's action that can be taken. Look at the march in Paris. Because of the security concerns, there, unfortunately, protests were banned. So 20,000 people left their shoes with notes, including the shoes of the Pope, which, may I say, were very nicely shined. So, these symbolic gestures are massive. They make governments wake up to the challenges before. But at the same time, we've got to lobby fervently from outside. We've got to work from within. We've got to be stealth-like and cunning. And we've got to be fifth columns working within government. So I think your point, young man, you played a number of instruments very well, John. I think we're globalizing too many issues. It's the wrong level of governance to solve this issue, even though, yes, ideally, we do need a legally binding global regime. But I have been involved in multilateral environmental negotiations since I had no gray hair. And I can tell you, it's virtually impossible to get 197 countries to agree by consensus. There isn't a, this is very sad. Democratically elected government in the world that takes decisions by consensus. This does not work. So we need to think about how do we deal with these issues at the level of governance where there's a community of interest and a chance that governments are going to agree to meaningful action. Tessa, you are not alone. You're coming with me to Switzerland.
Questions were amazing. I think this discussion shows, there's so much we'd love to continue to discuss it with you, but we want to be respectful of people's time. I think this discussion shows there's so much passion, there's so many ideas, there's so much energy. There is no cookie cutter solution. There will people come at this in different ways, and that's okay. The person who, we all need to work individually. Me started, but all of us in this room, you all as students fly way more than your peers because you're here at Pearson. I'm flying for this job, right? So we've got to look at all of that, but I really believe as important as individual action is, it is necessary, but far from sufficient. We are talking about 1.5 Celsius, I know is what the scientists are saying. So, okay, well, then it makes it more urgent, and it means that all of our individual actions alone will not add up to solve the problem. Just like the voluntary pledges in Paris will not add up to solve the problem, we need to be firing on all cylinders. So whatever individual action you take, I hope that involves pressuring some of the decision makers as well, that it doesn't just end with the decision with yourself. So it's got to be a starting point. And then what can we do here at Pearson collectively? These negotiations are happening for another 10 days, another 10 days. Yeah. So there's action that can be taken sooner rather than later. So let's be creative. Let's use our passion. Let's use our energy. Let's use the differences of opinion that we have here to come up with some really constructive ideas. So hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation and a big beginning of further action for all of us. And thank you for taking the time to come today, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Right after this, Johannah will be leading the simulation, the final closing simulation. Any of you are welcome to come as observers or be NGOs or whatever it is. We can incorporate you into the process. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank Johannah on behalf of Pearson College for coming and hanging out with us for a few days.